A farmer in northern England once stood in his field and watched his entire world burn. It was the summer of 793 AD, and the Vikings had just hit the monastery at Lindisfarne, the first recorded raid that would launch 3 centuries of terror. The smoke rose black against the sky, the screams carried on the wind, and this farmer, a man whose name was never written down, made a decision that would save his family and change how his village thought about survival. He did not run. He did not hide. He did not pray for mercy. Instead, he grabbed a shovel, walked to the edge of his property and began to dig. His neighbors thought he had lost his mind. But 6 months later, when the longships returned, that hole in the ground became the reason 23 people lived through the night. This is not a story about kings or warriors. This is not about battles or armies. This is the untold history of ordinary people, farmers, fishermen, monks, mothers, children, who faced the most brutal raiders Europe had ever seen and survived not through strength, but through intelligence, through adaptation, through sheer human ingenuity born of desperation. These people had no training, no weapons, no walls, but they had something the Vikings did not expect. They had the will to outsmart death itself. Welcome to English Mindset, where we step into the moments history overlooks, the stories of common people who faced impossible odds and found ways to endure. Today, we are walking into the Viking Age, not as scholars, but as survivors. We are going to uncover the clever, brutal, heart-breaking tactics that ordinary people used to stay alive when the dragon ships came. And if you have ever wondered what you would do when everything you love is threatened, when there is no help coming, when survival depends entirely on your choices, then stay with me. Because the lessons from these forgotten people are not just historical, they are urgent, they are personal, they are alive. The Viking Age began suddenly and without warning. In 793, Norse raiders struck the monastery at Lindisfarne, an isolated religious community on the coast of what is now northern England. The monks had no soldiers, no defenses, just faith and treasure. The Vikings killed many, enslaved others, and sailed away with gold, silver, and holy relics. The attack sent shockwaves across Christian Europe. How could such a thing happen? How could pagans desecrate God's house and face no consequences? But the real question was not theological. It was practical. How do you survive when warriors appear without warning, strike with overwhelming violence, and vanish before anyone can respond? For the next 300 years, communities across Britain, Ireland, France, and beyond were forced to answer that question. And the answers they found were as varied as the people themselves. The farmer I mentioned at the beginning understood something critical. Vikings raided for profit. They wanted treasure, food, slaves, and they wanted to get in and out quickly. If a target looked too difficult, too risky, or too poor, they moved on. So this farmer made his home look worthless. He buried his valuables, his tools, his seed grain, deep in the field, far from the house. He tore down part of his fence to make the property look abandoned. He even let weeds overgrow his garden. When the Vikings came through his area the second time, they glanced at his farm and kept walking. They hit the neighbors instead, the ones whose homes looked intact and prosperous. It sounds cold. It sounds selfish. And maybe it was. But survival in the Viking Age was not about fairness. It was about reading the enemy and making hard, ugly choices. The farmer did not betray his neighbors, but he did not sacrifice his family either. He made himself invisible. And invisibility, as it turned out, was one of the most effective strategies ordinary people had. Another tactic was misdirection. In a coastal village in Ireland, the villagers noticed that Vikings always landed at the same beach, the widest, flattest stretch of sand. So one winter, the villagers spent weeks moving large stones onto that beach just beneath the waterline. When the raiders returned in the spring, their ships ran aground on the hidden rocks. Hulls cracked, chaos erupted, and while the Vikings scrambled to save their ships, the villagers attacked from the cliffs above with rocks, burning branches, anything they could throw. It was not a fair fight, but it worked. The Vikings retreated, and that village was never raided again. Think about that for a moment. These were not soldiers. These were fishermen and farmers who understood their terrain better than any invader ever could. They used that knowledge as a weapon, and it saved them. If you are feeling the weight of these stories, if you are starting to see that survival is not about strength but about strategy, then let me ask you to do something. If this resonates, if you can see yourself in these people, hit the like button. Not because I am asking, but because these forgotten voices deserve to be amplified. And if you want to keep exploring the moments in history that reveal what we are truly capable of, subscribe to English Mindset and turn on notifications, because we are just getting started. Another strategy was community coordination. In many regions, villages set up early warning systems. They built watchtowers on hills and cliffs. They assigned lookouts, usually boys or old men, who could spot sails on the horizon and ring bells or light signal fires. When the warning came, everyone knew what to do. Valuables went into hiding. Livestock was driven into the woods. The young and the elderly moved to pre-designated safe locations, caves, dense forests, swamps, anywhere the Vikings would not follow. In one recorded case from the Hebrides, a network of islands off the coast of Scotland, villagers used a relay system of bonfires to warn each other. When one island spotted Viking ships, they lit a fire. The next island saw the smoke and lit theirs. Within an hour, dozens of communities knew danger was coming and had time to prepare. This system saved countless lives, not because it stopped the raids, but because it bought time. And time, in a crisis, is the most valuable resource. There was also the tactic of strategic submission. Some communities, especially those that were raided repeatedly, learned that fighting back often made things worse. Vikings respected strength, but they also respected pragmatism. So some villages made deals. They offered food, silver, or goods in exchange for being left alone. It was a form of tribute, and it was humiliating. But it worked. The Vikings took what they wanted and moved on without burning, killing, or enslaving. A monk named Alcuin, who lived through the early Viking raids, wrote letters describing how some communities negotiated with the raiders, offering supplies in exchange for safe passage. He condemned it as cowardice. But the people who survived did not care about his judgment. They cared about their children. They cared about living through the night, and they made the choice that gave them the best chance. Was it right? Was it honorable? History does not answer those questions. History only records who lived and who died. And the ones who negotiated, who swallowed their pride, who chose survival over glory, they lived. Now, let me tell you about the women, because their role in survival has been almost entirely erased from the historical record. Women in the Viking Age could not fight in the traditional sense, but they were the backbone of survival. They managed the hiding places, they coordinated evacuations, they tended the wounded, they preserved food, knowledge, and morale, and in some cases, they became decoys. In a village in Denmark that was frequently raided, the women developed a strategy. When the warning came, the men and children hid. But a few older women stayed behind, dressed in their best clothes, acting as if life was normal. When the Vikings arrived, these women greeted them calmly, offered them food and drink, and kept them distracted while the rest of the village escaped. It was incredibly dangerous. Some of these women did not survive, but their sacrifice bought time and saved lives, and their courage deserves to be remembered. Let me ask you something. Could you do that? Could you stay behind knowing you might die to give others a chance to live? What does that kind of courage look like in your own life? Drop a comment and tell me, because I want to know. What do you think it takes to stand in the gap when everything is falling apart? There was also the tactic of camouflage and deception. Some villages, especially those near forests or marshes, built false settlements. They constructed crude huts and left them empty, filled with broken pottery and worthless junk. When Vikings raided, they hit the decoy village first, wasted time looting nothing, and by the time they realized they had been tricked, the real village had either fled or fortified. One account from the Frankish chronicles describes a village that built an entire fake granary filled with rotten grain and straw. The Vikings broke in, saw the grain, celebrated, and only later realized it was spoiled. By then they had moved on, convinced the area was poor and not worth a return visit. It was brilliant, it was risky, but it worked. Another survival method was the use of hidden shelters. In many regions, people dug underground chambers called souterrains, tunnels, or earth houses. These were not just storage spaces. They were emergency refuges. When the alarm sounded, families would climb down into these dark, cramped spaces and wait, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, until the danger passed. Children were taught from a young age to stay silent, to control their breathing, to endure the darkness. Because one cry, one cough could give them away. Archaeologists have found these structures all over Britain, Ireland, and Scandinavia. They are narrow, damp, and terrifying. But they saved lives. And the people who built them understood something profound. That survival often means enduring discomfort, fear, and darkness with no guarantee of safety. It means trusting the plan even when every instinct screams to run. And then there were the people who fought back. Not with swords or shields, but with traps, ambushes, and guerrilla tactics. In regions where Viking raids became routine, some communities organized resistance. They did not meet the Vikings on the beach. They waited. They let the raiders land, let them move inland, and then attacked from the forests, the hills, the narrow passes where the Vikings' numbers and equipment became liabilities. One famous case involved a village in what is now Norway, ironically, where a group of farmers lured a raiding party into a valley and triggered a rock slide. Dozens of Vikings were killed or injured. The survivors fled. And the farmers, ordinary men with families and farms, stood at the top of that cliff and watched their enemies retreat. They did not celebrate. They did not boast. They just went home. Because survival was not glorious. It was necessary. There is also the haunting reality of those who did not survive, who made mistakes, who were unlucky, who were betrayed. Not every clever plan worked. Not every hiding place held. Not every negotiation succeeded. The historical record is full of villages that were wiped out, populations enslaved, entire communities erased. And we have to acknowledge that, because survival in the Viking Age was not guaranteed. It was a lottery of geography, timing, leadership, and sheer chance. But the ones who did survive, the ones whose strategies worked, they passed down their knowledge. They told their children, they taught their neighbors, and slowly, over generations, communities learned. They adapted. They became harder to raid. And eventually, the Viking Age ended. Not because the Vikings were defeated in some grand battle, but because raiding became less profitable, less predictable, less safe. The ordinary people, the ones without armies or castles, made survival so difficult that the cost outweighed the reward. That is the power of ordinary people. That is the power of adaptation. That is the power of refusing to be helpless. Now let me bring this into the present, because the lessons from the Viking Age are not trapped in the past. They speak directly to us now. We live in a world where threats are different, but no less real. Economic collapse, natural disasters, social unrest, pandemics. These are the raids of our time. And the question is the same. How do you survive when the systems you rely on fail? How do you protect what matters when no one is coming to save you? The answers are the same too. You prepare, you adapt, you coordinate with your community, you stay calm, you use your knowledge of your environment, you make hard choices, you do not wait for permission or rescue, you act. That is what the farmer did when he dug his hole. That is what the villagers did when they moved the rocks. That is what the women did when they stayed behind. They acted. And here is the most important truth. Survival is not about being the strongest or the bravest. It is about being the smartest, the most flexible, the most willing to do what needs to be done. The Vikings were stronger. They had better weapons, better ships, better training. But they did not always win, because the people they attacked learned. They adapted. They survived. So what does that mean for you? It means you do not have to be a warrior to protect yourself and the people you love. You just have to be willing to think, to plan, to learn from history, and to act when the moment comes. That is the legacy of the ordinary people who faced the Vikings. And that is the mindset we are building here at English Mindset. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about resilience, about courage, about what you would do in a crisis, then I need you to do something. Share this video. Not because it helps the algorithm, though it does, but because these stories matter. These lessons matter. And the more people who hear them, the stronger we all become. Let me tell you one more story before we end. There was a boy, maybe 12 years old, living in a village on the coast of England. His name is lost to history. But his story survived. When the Vikings came, his father told him to run, to take his younger sister into the forest and hide. The boy obeyed. He grabbed his sister's hand and ran. But halfway to the trees, he realized he had forgotten something. His mother's necklace, the only thing of value they owned, was still in the house. He stopped. His sister begged him to keep going, but he let go of her hand and ran back. By the time he reached the house, the Vikings were inside. He hid behind a fence and watched as they tore the place apart. They found the necklace. They laughed. They pocketed it. And then they left. The boy waited until they were gone, then sprinted back to the forest. His sister was safe. His parents, who had hidden in the root cellar, were safe. The house was destroyed, but they were alive. And years later, that boy told his own children about the day he learned that things can be replaced, but people cannot. That survival is not about what you save. It is about who you save. That lesson, that mindset, is what we need to carry forward. Because the world is unpredictable. Danger comes without warning. And when it does, the choices we make, the plans we have, the knowledge we possess, those are what determine whether we endure or fall. So let me ask you one final time. What would you do? If the world you knew disappeared tomorrow, if you had to protect the people you love with nothing but your wits and your will, what would you do? Think about it. Really think about it. And then tell me in the comments, because these are not abstract questions. These are the questions that define us. Thank you for walking through this history with me. Thank you for caring enough to listen, to learn, to remember. If this video gave you something valuable, hit the like button. If you want to keep exploring the forgotten stories that still teach us how to live, subscribe to English Mindset and turn on notifications. Because we are building something here. A community of people who refuse to be passive, who learn from the past, who prepare for the future, and who understand that ordinary people, when pushed to the edge, are capable of extraordinary things. The Vikings came, they burned, they killed, they took, but they did not win. Because the ordinary people, the ones whose names were never written, whose faces were never painted, whose voices were never recorded, they survived, they adapted, they endured. And we are here today because of them. We carry their blood, we carry their resilience, we carry their mindset. And that mindset is simple. Never give up. Never assume you are helpless. Never wait for someone else to save you. Look at what you have. Look at where you are. Look at who you love. and then do whatever it takes to protect it. That is the legacy of the Viking Age. That is the lesson of ordinary people facing extraordinary danger. And that is the truth we must never forget. I will see you in the next story. Until then, stay strong, stay smart, stay ready. Because history repeats. And when it does, the ones who remember, the ones who learned, the ones who prepared, they are the ones who survive.